5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. This is Vinita Shetty from my home office in Barcelona, Smart Citizen. And we're very pleased to have Anupam Yog, who's at the National University of Singapore, speak to us as placemakers. Without spending too much time, I'd like to hand over to Saurav Roy to introduce him, and then he can take over from there and make a presentation. There'll be room for Q&As, so please don't hesitate to use the chat function to pose some questions, and we can have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of his presentation. So over to you, Saurav.
So I'll just read a brief profile about Anupam. Anupam Yog is a creative strategist with experience in competitive positioning of countries, cities, destination, and places. Passionate about urban innovation, Anupam is an avid community organizer and champion for walkable cities. There's a fairly long profile that Vinita sent me about Anupam, but I'll also keep it short and personal as well.
Please do. In fact, make it personal. I don't worry about the other stuff.
So I think I've been working with Anupam now for close to a decade now. And initially for the launch of community-focused lifestyle centers by Virtuous Retail, and post that with him for National University of Singapore. In fact, my foray into placemaking started really with Anupam, and he introduced me to the systems way of thinking that placemaking sort of brings. And what I found is that he brings a unique ability to straddle strategic objectives with a very keen eye for design and detail, and which is what has made it a delight for me to be associated with him. He has crafted and implemented global campaigns for Brand India, most notably at World Economic Forum in Davos, successfully positioning India as the fastest growing free market democracy. And Anupam has also been recognized as one of India's leading urban innovators by Metropolis, World Association of Major Metropolis in Indian Cities, Managing Urban Growth. So I think he'll have a unique insight into not just placemaking, but also his thinking process in today's session. And I'm really looking forward to what he's going to share with us now. So over to you, Anupam.
Terrific. Thank you. This is the first Zoom webinar I'm doing, so full disclosure that this may go terribly wrong. So you'll have to be patient with me. And I hope that this will be useful for you as much as it certainly is for me. So thank you both, Vinita and Saurav. Vinita had asked me to, structure the presentation, sort of 3 questions really. A question, a strategy, and a purpose is what I've called it. I believe you're all at the forefront of this movement on placemaking in India, which I'm delighted to play some role in. I've been part of the Placemaking Leaders Council for many years at the Project for Public Spaces, and Ethan Kent and Fred Kent and others who in some ways have created the modern placemaking movement. So it's great that it's found a place and home in India. Obviously, placemaking has a very old history in India. I mean, call it by whatever name, but placemaking and city making go back hundreds, if not thousands of years in a civilizational context in the Indian subcontinent. So I'm very much hoping that this movement, which has found a spark in all of you, grows rapidly. And I'm very fortunate and privileged to be supporting it and helping it in whatever way I can. So the proposed flow, I think Roy has already done an introduction, but I thought it might be useful to dive in a little deeper into me, my background, and my work. I think on the call, there's someone called Arun Myra who's here, and he's been one of my mentors, and I think I can safely call him a friend now, and he's been an inspiration. And I've learned a lot from him, and he recently told me a phrase that which I really resonates with me. It's like we were talking about the work that I suppose we all do, and I come from a world of branding, so I use that word quite trivially, I think. So I talk about people as brands, places as brands, everything as a brand. But I sometimes forget that it sounds probably crude when you describe a person as a brand. So when I think of myself as a brand, I actually realize that I probably am not so interested in promoting myself. But I think Vinita inspired me to say, no, you must talk about yourself, because if you want to talk about your ideas, then you should think about yourself as a channel for your ideas. So I like that very much. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, because I think it will help establish some context. So I'll take about 10 minutes to do that. It's about 4:49 now, and I'm going to try and stay to time. And then mostly this is a certain set of provocations followed by discussion. And I've allocated about 15 minutes for that. It could perhaps extend to a little bit more, but that's sort of the broad flow for today. So without further ado, I'm a Lucknow boy. That's, I don't know how many of you have been to Lucknow, but that's my school. I'm a very proud product of La Martiniere. I'm a railway kid. My father was in the railways. I was born and brought up in Lucknow. I go back to my hometown, try and do it every year, at least once. And it's a beautiful city, and I very much hope to play a role in its continued agenda for livability. I think it's like many other cities, it's going through a set of challenges in India, and I hope that it can be revived to its former glory, and perhaps even adopt some new paradigms to change for the better. Roy has already taken you through this. These are some different personas this is my LinkedIn profile. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I did only one, I think there's only one journalist who made the mistake of interviewing me. And that's the only time I've ever given an interview. So this was, and the article was titled Metro Yogi. I don't know why she thought it was good to call me Metro Yogi, but I suppose over the years, the metro part I got because it's cities. The yogi part obviously was a play on my last name. But I have to say, I truly like that phrase now, because about 2 years ago, I had a tryst with meditation and mindfulness, and I quite like that phrase. So I wear it proudly now. And that journalist is now my wife. So I guess it was all right. So I must have done something well in that interview. But, I think of myself as a lifelong learner. I'm very much focused on cities, but I enjoy marketing and branding. This is my work. I think that's what I really want to talk to you about. I started a company called Mirabilis many years ago. The company is still sort of there, but it doesn't do any work except serves as there's a website which I maintain for sentimental reasons. And I do some amount of research through this platform. So it's applied research and education on topics like place branding, placemaking, which is very much the topic of today. And also extending it to place management and place operations. I think this is very much an emerging discipline, but I think of it through all of these lenses. I think placemaking is only one component of it. And then of course, there's the larger context of city making. And on the bottom left, this is where I began my career. And I still think of nation and city branding as an academic discipline, which I retain an interest in, and I continue to do work in that. The other work I do very much is my primary focus now is healthy cities. This is a current focus, has been a focus for the last 2 years, linking mindfulness and the city. So that's a little bit about my work, but we'll get to the topic. I think I managed to do the introduction into me in 3 minutes, so I have 7 more minutes now. But I made a trip to Delhi. I don't know how many of you can read that, but it says, "Yahan gyan na baatiye, yahan sabhi gyan." And I think that could be true for most discussions in an Indian context. We all love to talk. Not sure how many like to listen. I am certainly trying very hard to listen as much as I talk. Probably, listen much more than I talk. But this was a wonderful slogan in the office of a company I visited in Delhi last year. So I made this trip, and I must talk to you later in the presentation about a couple of case studies. But I think I hope you will indulge me, because I'm doing exactly the opposite today of what this is suggesting. I'm bartering some gyan. I hope you will be patient with me. I hope the gyan is useful. And of course, the second part is absolutely true. You're all gyanis. And so hopefully we can have a wonderful discussion and dialogue together. So let me start with the first part of what I think I've been asked to do. What makes placemaking in South Asia distinct from tactical urbanism in the US? So I think 4 categories of things. Context, I mean, that's the most obvious one. The US, which has seen the birth of the modern placemaking movement with the likes of Jane Jacobs and others, certainly is inspiration and has continued to be so even after decades. And in many ways, we are relearning placemaking through the likes of, as I said, Jane Jacobs and others, and the Project for Public Spaces. But the context really is quite different. History, obviously, we are a very different country, or we are a very different set of countries if you think about it as South Asia. The US is a young country, relatively speaking. India is also a young country. In fact, it's a younger country. It's only 70 years old. And sometimes I think we forget that we're a very young country, and we're too harsh on ourselves for all the things that have happened in merely 70 or so years since independence. We might be a old civilization, but we're a very young country. We're a very nascent political idea, and still a very difficult democracy in the making. So I think we need to be patient, a lot more patient than we currently are. And the place in present time, when you think of placemaking in South Asia and placemaking in the US, I think the place in present time for both these countries or both these regions is very, very different. I think the challenges are very different. The opportunities are very different. The socio-economic profiles are very different. The culture is very different. And sometimes we tend to tell stories and generalize and try and fit them into neat boxes. But the reality is it's very different. And we need to understand our context a lot better before we borrow from elsewhere. I am going to be talking about borrowing. So this is why I think this is very important to highlight that context matters. It doesn't mean we cannot borrow, but we must borrow with clarity, purpose, intent, and then also adapt to context. So that's the first very important distinction. The second distinction is nature of resources. And I've listed out 5 there. Money. I don't think India has as much, or South Asian countries have as much as the US. Institutions. I think, again, the very state of time of development where the US is, it's blessed with many, many more institutions. This is not a discussion on the US, so I'll limit myself to the discussion on institutions in India. I think there was a gentleman earlier, Vikash, who's here from one of the institutions and was sharing his experience, how the pandemic has actually empowered cities and local officials and local communities a lot more. I think that's very timely, perhaps in fact late, but better late than never. I think we need stronger local institutions. So we need a lot more capacity, and not all of it needs to flow from government. I think civil society is responsible in many ways for producing institutions that reflect the aspirations of people in society. I think government is only one kind of institution, and perhaps we are too dependent on government, and that's why we tend to be overcritical of it when it falls short in our eyes. People, we have many, so that's a very fundamental difference. We have many young people, so we have a demographic dividend, which has been argued by many that could become a demographic disaster. I completely disagree. I think people are a strength. Of course, we need institutions and money, the first two, to harness the energy of people. Skills, I think there is certain value in, I think there's a lot of value in practice. And I think in some ways we have underinvested in the skills and education agenda. And skills are not necessarily vocational, but I mean skill in the broadest sense possible. So this is also very different, because I think when it comes to placemaking as a skill, I think there is a lot more needed to develop it. And I do hope that Placemaking India is going to play a role of that. And then the agenda. I think the agenda is very different, which therefore how you harness resources changes. So I think the lack of actually an agenda around tactical urbanism is what I would call a challenge in the Indian or South Asian context. There is an agenda, I think, in the US. The agenda is shaped by many people, many institutions. So I think placemaking, again, India is a great start. The third most important distinction I would make is around values. I think this is also rooted in culture, but I would say we have a very different interpretation of civic sense. And often this gets dismissed at a superficial level that we don't have a civic sense. I actually disagree. I think we have a very deep sense of community and culture and what could be called civic sense. I just think that it's often at cross purpose with what is the Western notion of civic sense. And of course, there are some basics that anybody would argue are necessary. And I think there's a lot of work that's happened in that direction. But I think we do need to do more in terms of educating communities on civic sense. And that starts with actually thinking about it as a value. And then the social compact. I think we, again, civilizationally, we are at odds with some of the institutions that have come around after the independence of India, because the way we think of communities, the way we think of the social compact is quite different culturally. I mean, families play a big role in the way we design our lives. So I think there is a lot of work to be done, science, evidence-based work that has to be done to figure out and detail what a social compact in the South Asian context means. And then finally, I would submit that a vision is what's distinct. I think leadership is a subcomponent of this. I think it's not just one leader or one set of leaders. I think we really need to consider a dynamic vision as opposed to a static vision, particularly when it comes to placemaking, whether it's tactical urbanism or strategic urbanism, whether it's livable cities or lovable cities, whether it's housing, transport, waste. Each of these, whichever lens you look at it, we still need a dynamic vision to make 1 square kilometer or 1,000 square kilometers of urban, something. We really do need to consider vision, and that's a very important part of how we manage the first 3 things: context, nature of resources, values, and vision. So I hope this gives you some perspective on my view on this question, and I would love to hear yours when we get into the discussion. I want to dig a little deeper on the action, as in, why is it that we don't manage to get our cities, I think our cities fail us a lot, and I think we crib about them a lot. But why is that? And hopefully it's not an oversimplistic generalization. I've thought about this a great deal, and I would argue that there's 3 things going on. I think there's a bunch of people who are stuck in the past. So there's a lot of talk about history and heritage and culture and how our past was glorious and we need to revive it, and so on and so forth. I think that requires a certain sort of management, but I don't think we need to be stuck in the past. I think there's a whole bunch of other people and institutions and consulting firms that project these wonderful visions of India's urban awakening, the golden bird, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of people that are competing between the past and the future. I think what really is happening is a neglect of the present. And that's where I would focus our attention, that we need to really focus on the present. And how do we do these 3 things? And that's where I'm sort of being prescriptive, I suppose, that we should learn how to document the past, that's a skill, whether it's storytelling or heritage conservation. And there are many people who are doing that. But, those same people need to engage with the people who are envisioning the future, because I think there needs to be room for both planning and storytelling, foresight and heritage conservation. But underlying all of that, and I think this is the crucial piece, we need to manage the present. We are all living in the now. If we are stuck in the past or daydreaming about the future, we're neglecting the past. And this needs disproportionate attention. So if I were to allocate time and money and energy, I would allocate 20% on the first 2 and 80% on the last one, which is manage the present, which is not just governance and structure, but it's actual development. And guess what? Development requires developers. So I do think that many times these discussions don't include developers. And I've been on the dark side. I went into real estate development, Roy and I worked together in that context. I still call it the dark side because it exposed me to challenges of development. The dark side is not real estate developers. The dark side is actually development. And that's what we need to unpack and make it accessible. And what I call an owner's mind, an owner's mindset. I think we all need to cultivate that. I don't know how many of you own a house. I actually don't, or a piece of land. I also don't, but I do think that cultivating an owner's mindset has helped me a lot in thinking about the entire city as my own. Wherever I go, that place I kind of make my own at that point. So I need to participate in it and contribute to it and help manage it. So I think that to me is hopefully a completer answer of what makes placemaking in South Asia distinct, but also what we could do in terms of tactical urbanism. And this is a big subject, so I'll stop here, but I would be very happy to pick this up offline with any of you. This is a subject I deeply care about and would love to engage any of you in any of your cities or neighborhoods where you might live, and if you want to go deeper. So a strategy, I think this is where I would want to build on what I just said. I want to talk about a specific idea today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of business improvement districts. I suppose if you're involved with placemaking, you must be. And if not, then I would encourage you to learn about them. There are thousands of business improvement districts around the world. In fact, that area has developed a lot more to actually beyond businesses. So I've called it XIDs, improvement districts in general. And it could be to improve anything. This is not a discussion on bids in general. So I will restrict from talking about what a bid is. And I assume that there is a general level of understanding of what that is. So I would argue that in the South Asian context, in the Indian context, we need to look at varying sizes of communities and really figure out who are the institutions who can own an urban vision for a neighborhood or a place. And I would say that that's what we really need to focus on, because this is a very interesting scalable model to introduce a set of principles, to introduce governance and managing, to avoid neglect of the present. And it could be a slum improvement district. At the end of the day, improvement districts creates an owner's mind, an owner's mindset for the community. And it allows participatory planning and so on and so forth. So this is at a high level a strategy I'm proposing. It can be achieved through two specific ways, through city labs. And that also is a broad idea, but there is a lot of evidence now that city labs are ways which could reside in universities or schools or in corporations or in governments for that matter. But they need to be open. They need to be an open system because the city is an open system. And networks. I think we can learn from networks and how they come about. We now know, I again don't want to talk about network effects, but effectively we need to bring a lot of this thinking from biology to business into city making. And I argue it can be done through XIDs in the South Asian context. A purpose. I think this is the third and final part of the presentation, and then I share some case studies, and it sort of builds on the lines of bids. I think placemaking is not an abstract notion which many consider it to be. I think we are partly as placemakers at fault because we assume that this is an art. I think this is as much a science as it's an art, and whether you're an architect, a designer, an engineer, a business strategist, anyone, I think we have a responsibility to, if we truly care about placemaking as a multidisciplinary sector, we need to think about it through the lens of livelihoods and jobs. And I think that, again, going back to the first point of development, embrace development. And development can happen through a variety of instruments. It can be private, it can be public, it can be public and private, it can be public and community and private. There are a whole bunch of models that are available now. And that's where I meant earlier, borrow, adapt, implement. So I think I talk about this, I'm sure you may have heard of NIMBY. I talk about the need for Placemaking India to say yes in my backyard. And I quite literally mean that, because change can begin incrementally at a neighborhood level. And I think we get too caught up with the macro, right? Really big change, which is also, there should be room for that. But I really think that you can begin at a neighborhood level, and we ought to begin at a neighborhood level. And cities and places are dynamic. So the only constant is change. So this point again of being stuck in the past or constantly imagining some vision of the future leads to neglect of the present. And I would say that when you say yes in my backyard, figure out a project. It could be as simple as a community garden. It could be as simple as some sort of a street improvement project. And I do see through my LinkedIn feed often, because I'm not able to travel to as many places I would like to. And certainly now it's going to be very difficult. But I'm seeing some wonderful changes and interventions in the Indian urban context. And I think that's fabulous. Change has to be small, manageable, but if it happens at scale, 1,000 small changes can mean a very, very big change. So hence I go back to this point of a XID. And if we create a movement around XIDs, I think we may end up with a portfolio of projects that can result in a very big change, albeit each individual change will be a small one, but once you aggregate it, it can be very powerful. And this is where I want to emphasize that planning is important, but a plan in itself is not an outcome. And I don't want to dwell on the fact that most of our master plans have failed cities, and we really need to revisit planning. I think planning has to be done in all of these horizons, and I list out several: a 100-year plan, a 50-year plan, a 30-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 1-year plan, and then a 3-month plan. And you need to monitor and manage that plan on a day-to-day basis and measure the outcomes. And I think this is possible. I'm fortunate to, at least for now, live in a city called Singapore, which I think is remarkable at planning. It didn't happen by accident. It is a complex adaptive system. It's a living organism, and there are many institutions and many planners who coordinate on an hour-to-hour basis, not just a day-to-day basis. There's a whole system in motion to manage this city and plan for this city. And if you've not visited Singapore, I would certainly encourage you to come here, maybe as Placemaking India, lead a group, visit the Urban Redevelopment Authority City Gallery, and see for yourself, I think, what good planning can achieve. And I think India has wonderful talent, universities, places which can own urban planning, but I just think we should simply need many more planners. Number one, I think urban planning as a discipline, its time has come, and we just need many, many more, thousands, if not tens of thousands of urban planners. And then I do talk about placemaking at scale as a purpose. I think this is very critical. So while I talk about livelihoods and yes, in my backyard, I also think there needs to be room for 1 or 2 mega projects in cities, or even more, depending on how imaginative a city could be. I think you can take, whether it's in Mumbai, the eastern seaboard, or whether it's in Delhi, the nalas, the network of nalas, and there are probably many, many more. And ideas in India, I think if you hunt for it, it'll be in every neighborhood. We have, we have wonderful planners in everywhere in India. I just think they don't know that they're wonderful planners. So I think we need to figure out ways to bring out talent. I list out a few as examples: parks, libraries, regeneration projects, and public markets. I think the main thesis for a mega project, however, and this is where I am very specific about this, should be cities for the many, not for the few, right? So we often are designing gated communities and such. And I think that's really not a great way to build a city, because you're really then planning for the few, you're making it for the few. And by the way, you will be in a gated community. And I think, of course, we are now in lockdown. So there are a whole bunch of things going on, but this is a great time to reconsider how do we make cities for the many and how we can leverage mega projects. And my last point on a purpose, and I think this is really critical, and my work focuses very much on well-being, is that all of it should really result in well-being and happiness. I don't care, frankly, if there's growth of 7% or not, or 10% or whatever. I think that's a very crude measure. It's an important measure, and that's why I clarify that financial sustainability is a part of this, but it is not the end. Well-being is the end. At the end of the day, we are all people, and if we forget that we are on this planet for one life, and if that one life is not about our well-being and our community's well-being, then I think it's all for naught. So with that, I sort of end the theory and the Gyan part of this. I do want to talk a little bit about case studies. Oh, apparently not. So there is still some more Gyan left. I apologize. So I guess I'm simply putting it together, and this is sort of my theory of urban transformation and change. The 3 things I spoke about: context or vision, or a vision based in context, strategy, and purpose. If we need all 3, we need all 3 for success. And so I've simply put it in a, I think that data is important. So I always like formulas, and I think this is the formula for places for people and people for places. Yes, and the case studies. So I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 case studies. I'm actually not going to talk much about one. It's behind me. You can see Singapore is this, it's actually, this picture is of a wonderful mega project called Gardens by the Bay, which is part of another mega project of Marina Bay. And there's enough and more about this. So I certainly can't talk to it as an expert, but I can, as a user, I find it enormously beneficial as a student to go and study this, and of course to visit it. But I think the effects of this mega project in Singapore are still continuing, and it's worth investigating and studying it and seeing, not to replicate it, but to look behind it and see what were the things they were trying to achieve. They were not trying to create the physical asset alone. It was the consequences of the creation of the physical asset that they were trying to achieve, which is where I think we need to think about what kind of mega projects should we really be implementing. Are they flyovers and roads and mega buildings, or are they bigger ideas which many can benefit from, like parks and libraries and performance centers and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about two. I spent this winter in Delhi and I visited two places. One is called Anand Gram, which I visited because of an invitation from a friend, and they were organizing a convocation ceremony at this place. I think it's gone straight to Hoskas. So I'll go to Hoskas first. So I went to Hoskas village. I've been there many times. It had completely changed, or not completely, but significantly changed. And I spent a day there just observing, taking pictures. I have thousands of pictures, so I picked a few randomly. I'll tell you what struck me though, that the place, of course, it was still popular. It was popular with younger people. You can see that there's a monument which has some kind of open access, but it was a bit odd in terms of how that access had been created. So clearly it was a mess. I mean, number one, it was a mess. What was not a mess, however, within this sort of mixed use, dense urban village was a temple and a school. So you see one picture of a clean alley there, with some nice art on the wall. That's actually a school. And of course it was a Sunday, so it was shut, but it was clean. And then you see this Hanuman Mandir. It was clean too, very clean. Very neat. Of course, it's been used as a trash dump also a little bit. But I thought it was fascinating that amongst the urban chaos, you had these two places, a school and a temple, which were kind of left untouched. And somebody was obviously caring about them. So I thought this was fabulous. And I encountered a cat also. Cats are great meditators. So of course, a cat was enjoying the temple. But my point here is that, if you look at the character of this place, there's some fascinating insights in even these few pictures. And you have private ownership, closed gates, which arguably, why do you need a closed gate in a village? I don't know, but obviously we know why they exist. You obviously had vehicles overrunning the place. That's an easily solvable one. So clearly this, in my mind, this is a great candidate for a business improvement district. There was a lot of interesting retail. So obviously people were, because of this, there are jobs being created. There's well-being being created because people love to visit these places. There is no coherent strategy. It's obviously happening on its own. And if there is one, it was not evident to me. So I think this is a great opportunity. I think it could be a launch candidate for a business improvement, a traditional business improvement district in the South Asian context. There's also, I don't think it was in Hoskas, it was in Green Park. I visited a think tank called Center for Civil Society, which is headed up by a friend. And I loved it. I loved that this sign was there. This was the entrance of the office, role of civil society in making our cities a better place to live. Of course, it was on a street that was maddening. But I think this is the challenge and opportunity of our cities. And I think we owe it to ourselves to create these maybe improvement districts in our cities and hopefully shape them for a better. And then I want to talk about Anand Gram, which is obviously not a public setting. It's a privately owned estate in Mehrauli. I also visited Mehrauli, the actual village, which is full of narrow streets. In fact, it's not even accessible by vehicles. It's another country, not even another town. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I am a member of something called the Global Cultural District Network, and I won't spend time on it. You can Google it. We've been trying to find a couple of candidates from India. They don't exist, I suppose, because there aren't formally designated cultural districts in India. But this could be one, Mehrauli. And typically members are institutions. They could be museums, they could be foundations. So I love Anand Gram. It was serene, peaceful, perfect place for meditation. You can see on the right, there's this lovely convocation ceremony of this very interesting initiative. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. It's like an executive MBA for women. and it's called Vedika Scholars Program. And I was delighted to be invited to it because my daughter's name is Vedika. So I really had a wonderful Sunday watching professionals getting, their diplomas and also getting a chance to enjoy the wonderful art, nature, terracotta work. You can see that's actually that's a bull of bells. I don't know how many hundreds of bells have gone into creating that bull. That's a permanent art installation. And it was just lovely. And as soon as you step out, you of course have the metro. So it's completely urbanized now, Mehrauli. But in many ways, that chaos lends an opportunity for a strategic intervention, a cultural district that is operating on the principles of an open system. An open system necessarily means that you need to have some level of principle, but also flexible rules. And so you need active management. You need dynamic management of place. And you need, of course, governance, and you need resources, skills, people, all of the stuff that I mentioned ahead. But I thought these two case studies can perhaps land this movement in India. I suspect there are many more, dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, given the diversity and richness of the country that is India. So I'll stop here. I think I'm broadly on time. I think I made good on time, but that's pretty much the end of my presentation. And I'm very keen to hear your comments and questions and observations. And I apologize if it's not been of value. I hope it has. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Anupam. There's a note from Vikash that he recalls meeting you about a decade back at the India Habitat Center.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yes, we did something called the Habitat Summit. So that was one of the best projects of my life.
Yeah, and he really appreciates your presentation.
Thank you, Vikash. I'm sorry, I just opened the chat window, so now I can see that there are some comments. Thank you.
Great. And I actually had an initial question. When you say XIDs, what are the possible sort of X's that you're referring to? Business improvement districts. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, X was just a blank. I could call it blank IDs also, in the sense you fill in the blank. It could be the anchor for improvement is important. I mean, the BIDs have scaled across the world, partly because they were born in the West in the context of high street retail. And that's why they are called business improvement districts. And that's why the context matters. Urbanization as a phenomena has been managed very differently in industrialization times in Europe and of course in the US. So I think context in that situation has enabled business improvement districts. In fact, Singapore is perhaps the only Asian country that I'm aware of that has adopted business improvement districts. It's still an experiment that's ongoing. And Singapore has 9 or 10 now business improvement districts that are currently in motion at various stages of development. And they fundamentally enable community participation. So, I mean, at an extreme, and I don't even know if it's possible because I don't know enough about local context. But if you take the example of a slum, which I think is one of the most controversial words, right, in the Indian urban context. And I think while there is a lot more rich discussion around it, I think eventually it's a neighborhood. Call it by whatever name. It's a bunch of people living in a place, typically, walk to work, walk to home, most likely, or access to public transport. It's actually the most sustainable urban form in my mind, except that I think that doesn't mean you glorify it, because arguably the conditions for those participants in the neighborhood are not sufficient. And that's why it is not appropriate as in terms of quality and livability. However, it probably needs a framework that can enable an owner's mindset, which, by the way, slum dwellers have more than, I would argue, many other kind of residential dwellers. So could we think of a slum improvement district which enables a governance framework for the participants, the residents of that, whatever that slum area is, to convert a slum into a slum improvement district, which then charts out potentially a plan for regeneration. I also argue at the same time for a housing improvement district. I know in Lucknow, where my grandfather built a home outside the city. He was a farmer. And that home now has been engulfed by urbanization. So it's kind of sitting there, not a very large place, but reasonably large. So I always envision its name is Dhyan Ganga, named after my great-grandfather and grandmother. And Dhyan Ganga, if you know Hindi, means the river of meditation. And as now a active meditator, I feel like I was, so blessed to have a home called Dhyan Ganga. So I have a vision that could Dhyan Ganga initiate a housing improvement district in Lucknow, in Sitapur, because there is an opportunity to reshape that city, which unfortunately used to have a highway which was laned with at least 100-plus-year-old trees, huge trees, which were chopped down, criminal act, but they were chopped down. Hundreds of trees were chopped down that lined this road from Lucknow to Sitapur. And so, things like this happen all the time in India, and we know it. So I think improvement districts create an institutional ability for a city to respond and manage its agenda and be control of its agenda. And I think it should be a very important element of the urban fabric. And that's why I put the word X, letter X there, because it could be a university improvement district. It could be a school improvement district. And I just showed you in Hos Khas. It doesn't mean that other institutions can't participate, but we all know this theory of management. You need leadership. Leadership typically can't be, 100 people. You could co-lead, and there are structures that enable it. But I would simply submit that this is an idea of improvement district that works quite well. It's been tested, and let's adapt it and bring it to India.
Great. Yes, it would be really nice to have some case studies around this. I think you mentioned House Cars as a candidate for that, House Cars Village. Do any of the members or any of the guests have any questions for Anupam? Don't hesitate to unmute and ask him.
I'd like to ask a question.
Please go ahead, Arun.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Anupam has been my leader. He has brought me to understand the energy of cities and the energy of young people, particularly, who have a vision for making the city better for everyone. And yes, that meeting, Vikash, that you attended in the Habitat Center, I was there. And I got myself invited because I wanted to hear what young people, and Sanjeev is still young and was much younger then, young people were with different ideas, thinking about how a city could be made good for everyone. And at my time in the Planning Commission, I came across others. I was looking for examples of citizens shaping the cities for themselves. And I'm going to give this other just case study for you to consider, and then come to the point. This was Kalba Devi in Bombay, which is, in the heart of South Bombay. It's one of the densest business areas of Bombay. It's the old cotton market. It's the world's largest cotton market. And it's very congested because it's been built up over 300 years. Got temples and mosques and those things in it, and schools, but a lot of business, and people live above the shops and so on. And citizens felt that they would like to, change their city because they have changed, the families have changed, the nature of business has changed, and so on. So they got together themselves, and over a year and more, 2 years, they created a plan for their city in which they considered who would have to give up their land, and then what the rest would do to compensate that person for giving up space or giving up land, so that the city could take another shape. And it took a long time because it's not just the changing of the spaces, it was changing in some ways what people own. They own different things then in the city, or some got outside. This was all done by them. And they asked me to come and see it, to say that, citizens are doing this. I was mightily impressed because, there must be hundreds of thousands of people together who were involved in doing this. No government intervention. But their plan, and why they came to me, was that the government wasn't allowing them to proceed with the plan. And so I then were, of course, responsible on the government side in inquiring with the government people, why would you not let people shape their own city? And by the way, that plan didn't require government to invest anything. all the other cities were asking that if you want us to improve our city, then the government has to put money into it. And here were some people saying, we'll give the government back some money, but we'd like you to use the money for things around our area to make access easier. We don't need anything to be invested in our place. And it was a matter of power, actually, that the government people were feeling that, firstly, I mean, they exercise power because people need their money. If people say, I don't need your money, then they've lost their instrument of power. And basically, it is about losing power. So when we talk about changing the nature of the city, Anupam, and I want to ask, and you, Barcelona, thank you so much, and for including me here. And Vikash, I recognize you, and there was Pavitra Sriram from Davis. My daughter is a senior professor at Davis, Sunaina, and she works with migrant communities. Now she has to do it very much around Davis, in San Francisco and Oakland, about how they wish to reshape their places, but they are part of a larger system in which there are other powers and property rights that others have, and it's not so easy. So it's a matter of sharing power. We go back to Jane Jacobs, therefore. So in the process of change and shaping the city, Anupam, and I'm going to ask you to, if you would please say, Vinita, your thoughts on this and others. The process of governance of a city is a process of exercise of power. Presently, many people have got power, and it's the dark side, if I can borrow Anupam's expression. And it's the giving up of power to others whose city it really is that is the hard, difficult process. And that is why we're not able to get in Indian cities empowered governance of the people. We talk of mayors, we have them as showpieces, but there's no power really that is exercised by the people in determining how they would be governed and what the rules are that should apply from above to them. So how do you propose, Anupam, that we keep this power also into your pictures that you've been presenting? The movement of power and what the people can do who presently don't have power. In Singapore, it's okay because there's a benign government. I'm using a good word, yes. They, on behalf of the people, make sure there's a process that includes the people. But in many other places, in India, of course, it's certainly not like that. What's your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, observation, story, as well as the question. It's a very big question, and I think a very important one. I'll answer it in 2-3 different ways. I think individuals are not powerless. I think we all have individual power, and I have learned that over a period of time. I think that requires self-management and managing your mind and feeling empowered, and that only you can do for yourself. So that's sort of a precondition if you want to participate in a community. Yes, I think talking in the sense of institutional distribution of power inequitably, which is certainly an issue, I think, in many countries and places, and even in places like Singapore, one can argue. How do we redistribute or acquire power on behalf of the many? I think one of the ways I've suggested is a strategy to do that. I think it requires space to be created, which is currently been shrunk to. I think it's been so far a reductive discussion around how do you share power. I think sharing of power assumes that there is only so much power going around. I think we have to reimagine the pie, and we have to reimagine the city as a collective. And I think I spoke about this earlier as well, that an owner's mindset is very important, and managing the present is very important. So I don't think this is an overnight issue. So one, we have to be patient. And that's why you need those planning horizons. And that's why you need communities to come together and learn to cooperate and listen to one another. Borrowing from one of your book titles, Listening for Well-Being, I think we spend far too much time talking and not enough listening. And I don't think we like the word compromise, but in reality, any social compact requires compromise. And if you choose to participate in community, then you have to compromise. And I think that is where, unfortunately, so far, we haven't seen a mature urban dialogue, and therefore not mature urban institutions, and therefore not livable cities. And I don't think that, frankly, this can happen overnight, as I said. So we also need to practice acceptance. And I don't want to sound meditative about this, but in reality, we have to accept the reality before we can learn to change it. I find myself hugely encouraged by the conversations, at least I'm able to participate in, the sheer number of younger people. And it doesn't have to be younger only. I think the sheer number of people who have started to participate in this conversation. This group has a very interesting demographic spectrum of people who are older like myself, of people who are younger, I suspect, on this call as well. So I think age is not necessarily the issue here. I think the bigger opportunity is the sheer number of people who are becoming aware of this idea that we need to be in control of our urban destinies, that we need to be in control of our urban agendas. We need to activate institutions that are already lying passive and dormant in the city, universities and schools, that we need to patiently engage and develop these urban visions and manage the present. And of course, tell stories about the past, but not remain stuck in it. So I think we need this intergenerational dialogue. We need this diverse dialogue with the framework of institutions and resources so that we end up making changes incrementally and occasionally exponentially. By the way, a number of incremental changes will equal an exponential change. So I think part of it is just getting on with it. And that's why I've proposed a specific idea that has the ability to morph into many different institutions at a local level. I think change has to be local. So whether it's a market-based change, a housing community-based change, a temple improvement district, whatever, I think that is a way to acquire power, take control of the agenda, have negotiation and bargaining power. In reality, everything is a negotiation because with one community to the other. And then there are processes to make decisions and have outcomes. So as I said, I think we have to learn and hopefully deliver some of these changes in any number of cities that are there in India. Let's also focus on, I think someone was here in this group who said they're focused on urbanization in tier 2 cities. By the way, I don't know where these categories and labels come from. How is a city a tier 2 or a tier 3 city? I mean, I come from Lucknow. I don't know what it's called now. It's a tier 1 city from any perspective, at least from my perspective it is. And I suspect each of your cities is that you call home. I think this is where language also needs to be created. I remember at the Habitat Summit, we invented some language because livability had no direct translation. So we came up with this idea of Rehenshil Sheher. And I think these are the sorts of, we need vocabulary. We need urban planners. We need thousands and tens of thousands of urban planners, and we need to compensate them and enable them. And that can only happen through institutions, all kinds of institutions, community-based institutions, not just the ones that government creates, but we as civil society create. So I hope that answers your question in some way. I'm sure I haven't covered as much ground as you have, but I hope that addresses the question in some form.
But you opened a question, and thank you, and I'm not going to take your time. You talk about urban planners, and this is what I learned from you in those meetings. Urban planning used to be thought about so much as you said, the concrete and more formal allocation of the land and putting money into parts of it. And the Jane Jacobs way of urban planning was the citizens, they are the planners. And so there's a shift required, I think, in how we're going about enabling the citizens to be the planners of their own city and not have to depend on formally trained urban planners who think that they are in charge.
Thank you. Vinita, I don't know if you have any inputs. I've also requested if there are any other comments or questions, you can ask them in the chat group, or you can, I don't know how you can raise a hand here, but Vinita, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, actually, pertinent to what Mr. Myra was saying, one of our founding members had just pointed out the example of Magarpatta city in Pune. I'm not sure if you're aware, Arun, about
very much so. I've been involved with them too. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. And so that's a good example of how the community actually stood to, had a stake in the development, and they were able to live in the city and earn and live. One of our mentors, the Placemaking India movement, is XIDs. He's an activist and architect based in Mumbai Waterfront Center. And he's talked about the intervention, about linking up all the different democratic rights struggles and building networks of interventions to bring about a citywide transformation. So, I think the Mumbai Waterfront Center is a very good example of, how Juhu Beach was developed, and there's other examples in Mumbai also. So that's another good example. If you want, I can send you a link to his keynote speech at our inaugural, meeting, the Placemaking India. PK Das. I think you will definitely appreciate that.
Thank you.
What other people who have questions or want to add to this discourse?
I'd highly encourage people to switch on their videos, which would make for a much nicer screen. If you want.
Yeah, please do that. Yeah, please switch on your videos.
Hi. Hi, Anupam. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Pavitra Sriram again. And I think it was super succinct and, very informative about how you brought about the differences between, say, any development that happens in the US versus what happens in India, and what are our intents towards these projects and programs are in general. But I mean, there's one, not a case study as much, one like project that I've been closely associated with here in Chennai. It was a very small thing, a residents association that got in touch with the Smart City Commission, which is based in Chennai. And they just said that we have a couple of problems, and, can we have someone, can you improve this area as part of your Smart City mission and goals? And they got in touch with us. I was an urban planner in the city, and they got in touch with us, and we helped them create a design or space where, they can move forward with. But what happens usually, even in that setting, is that the community and the residents, even though, they're not equally represented through the entire resident association, like not all the residents are part of this association itself. So there is some disparity. You are not looking at the entire set of people who, are from that neighborhood. But at the same time, they're ready to pull up money and come to the table and, try doing some reform. But they do, at the end of the day, look at the corporation and say that, I'm paying your taxes and I expect something in return. And expect something in return comes in different forms and shapes. Like, of course, right now the corporation, I had a conversation about a week ago with somebody from the Smart Cities mission. And he said that, the corporation is basically strapped up after this entire coronavirus situation. And we don't even know when, they would be able to responsibly take forward projects like these, which involve public spaces, for example. So then there comes a nexus where associations are like, do we put in the entire money, or do we only come together, organize ourselves and ideate something and present our problems and look for solutions? Or do we also ask for money? Do we also fund this? Are CSOs available to fund this? Are organizations otherwise available to fund this? So then, like you said, in the US, there are different organizations which basically fund such smaller projects. They fund research of this kind. So I guess, I don't want to answer what I asked, but then basically to be able to mobilize the kind of funds that you receive from non-profit organizations, from foundations, is important as much as we get from corporations. But how would you react or, solve a problem like this?
Sure. You already had the answer in the question, I suppose, when you said you label your initiative as a small initiative, which I would certainly get rid of the small, because any initiative in the context of the urban reality that is Indian cities is phenomenal. Getting anything done is phenomenal. And I think I really admire anyone who lives in cities in India or anywhere else where they're at a stage of development which is clearly falls short of what it ought to be. So I think my simple reflection there is that we need new institutions at a manageable scale. I argue, in fact, for schools in particular, that can be an engine of change. I think there is someone in the group here called Sampreet Reddy who runs a company called Worldview. And we've been working together for the last year or so. He's been working for the last 10 years with schools and has created a wonderful curriculum called Future Sake, which engages with school children. At the end of the day, in reality, people who are studying in schools today are going to be city managers tomorrow or city residents tomorrow. So I think we need to manage a number of these agendas concurrently. I think you can't replace a municipality. At the end of the day, you do need municipal services, and there needs to be an agency at that level. But there needs to be many, many other agencies. By the way, Singapore, which is upheld as a paragon of planning, which in many ways it is, still continues to evolve its coordination mechanisms between many agencies. And I think that is a particular skill which gets reduced to facilitation. I think coordination and administration have for some reason acquired a bad name. I actually think they are the most important pieces in getting anything done. So I think if anyone is an administrator, hats off to them, because that's a very hard job. If anyone is a coordinator, you really need a multidisciplinary mindset, and you need an enormous range of skills, interpersonal skills and other kinds of skills, persuasion skills, negotiation skills. So these are the kind of skills that I'm talking about here. And I pulled out two specific templates, city labs and networks. I think you need networks at a local level, a regional level. I mean, you can think of it as any number of layers of networks, right? I think we jump too quickly to global networks and start competing, pushing ourselves in competition with many cities abroad or nationally, which is an obsession with governments everywhere and perhaps even with people. But in reality, rankings are nothing. At the end of the day, I think you need to rank your own place and the well-being of your community. So I think, in my opinion, initiatives like yours that you had been a part of are very important. You need many, I will just stay with the idea of IDs. It could be anything, call it by whatever name. But if you had 1,000 IDs in India, that's power. And that's, again, you can network those IDs. You can network them and exchange ideas and knowledge. I know we've tried to do this through some mechanisms, but any centrally and no disrespect to Mr. Arun Maira here, who was part of the planning commission, but I have a healthy disrespect for central planning in general. And I know he doesn't necessarily ascribe to that, and tried very successfully in many ways to change and bring a whole new way of thinking about inclusive planning and participatory planning. And I think that is really the right direction to go in. In fact, I would recommend his book, which is something I've read, 2 books, Transforming Systems and Listening for Well-being. I think there is a great deal, there is a big need for systems thinking in everything, but particularly in urban management and urban development. And I think listening, which is a very underrated skill. So I think, I hope that makes some sense and gives you some sort of an answer. I mean, you're the expert. You're already doing what you're doing. And if I can be helpful in any way, because it sounds like you're already part of the action agenda, I would love to help. By the way, I think there's this other phrase which has emerged, which everybody calls themselves, if they're in the think tank world, they say they're a do tank. I don't know what that means, but I think we need think tanks. I care a lot about theory as much as about practice, but theory is only good as practice. So we need a lot more practitioners for sure, but if it's not rooted in thinking, then I'm afraid it's not going to result in sustainable outcomes. So I hope there are as many think tanks, if not, not just do tanks. And again, ending with the notion of schools and universities as the primary owners of local urban agendas rather than anyone else could be a really good way to think about it.
Right, that's great. I mean, I think adding to that is also the fact that the very fact that you said XIDs, and just having seen different kinds of developments, whether they're business improvement districts, wherever they are in whichever part of the world, sometimes they do come with larger corporate companies, retail units come and take position in business improvement districts. And I guess And I guess that's why rooting it to schools and resident associations makes more sense, because they're more invested in the area that they're developing, or they're working towards.
I don't want to be, I have to be clear that I have nothing against retail. And in fact, I help build shopping malls, and,
Right.
I don't like shopping myself, but I think retail or any form of commerce is very important. It's the lifeblood of an economy. I think there's enough discussion going on about that in India at the moment, as elsewhere, about the lockdown and getting out of lockdown. I think
Right.
the distinction I would make with what you said is that it is not always the case that business improvement districts, in fact, in most cases, business improvement districts are a way to ensure that you don't have branded chains showing up on your high street. If you look at the US, that is why they
Right.
were born in the first place. So you
Right.
may have the occasional Starbucks in a high street in a suburban town. In reality, that's an exception, not the rule. They actually support local employment. They give space, and that's why the ID is a very good instrument to manage local agendas. And that should be perhaps embedded as a principle, that this is about local. But at the same time, you do need to engage with the rest of the ecosystem. So I think it's, again, going back to context and going back to skills and resources. It's a great way to raise money too. I know urban financing is a neglected subject as well, but it's not far from, I think, you'll have community banks. There are already many. Banks should be part of XIDs. Landlords obviously should be part of XIDs. Community and residents should be part of XIDs. So I think my point about schools and universities was, I just wanted to make them salient because I think they are passive. To the point about power, I think if you need a strategy to acquire power, I think start with, after all, schools and universities are on everyone's agenda. They're neutral, arguably they're neutral. They have great resource. They're typically on great real estate. So they could begin with themselves and the host neighborhoods where they are. And they have enormous influence that can be wielded for an urban agenda. Of course, you do need a strong administrator, team, and they need to be aware to this idea that they can play a role as an urban catalyst. I think many schools and universities think of themselves as powerless. And in reality, they have so much power, but it's not in admissions. I think that's where the energy is probably spent most. I work for a university. I think there's a disproportionate amount of attention that goes on admissions and not our real assets, and actually participating in the urban development and management of the urban fabric.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavitra. Are there any other questions from, I'd invite the guests also to pose any questions or take the discussion forward.
Yeah, I don't know if I can put Sampreet on the spot since he's here. I think he's Sam. I don't know if it's the same Sam, but if he's listening in, then he can probably say a few words about FutureSec and Worldview. I also note there's a friend of mine from Kathmandu. She runs a city lab in Kathmandu, and they're part of a network called Utopia that's building city labs across Asia and Africa and Latin America. And maybe she wants to say hi. I don't know many of the other names, but anybody else wants to say something, please feel free.
Hi, I'm Nikhil. Actually, I'm a student and I'm just here to learn, and there's so much to learn here. I just had one question, I have several questions, but I would like to pose one, that you kept on enforcing the point that people miss out on the present, and they always think about the past and the future, but they miss out on the present. So what will be a perfect example of where this present mindset was implicated? Because what I deciphered out of your presentation was small initiatives in locals and neighborhoods are what the present consists of. So I just wanted to clarify what exactly this present mentality composes of, because even if I'm studying right now and people keep on insisting me to revive the history and the heritage of a city, or just to think too much forward into the technological aspect and bring too much technology, which I know that the people are not ready for. So how to, what is the example and how to progress with this present mindset?
I wish I could give you a clear answer. I think it's really a mindset more than anything else. It comes from mindfulness practice. And I'm only a student of mindfulness. So I have a teacher of mindfulness amongst the group, but I don't know if she wants to be put on the spot. At a city level, I think Singapore is a very good example of a present mindset in the majority of its planners and its citizens. It engages very much in the present. By the way, there is a big movement for conservation in Singapore, but there's also, this is one of the most vibrant and well-regulated residential markets and commercial markets for real estate development. So both can coexist. I don't know, I've never visited Barcelona, but maybe Vinita wants to opine whether there's a present mindset in Europe, which, by the way, has some of the oldest heritage tourism-oriented towns and places. But I think there's a present mindset in places like London. There's active management. And I suppose that's what I mean by present mindset, that we need active management and constant negotiation for outcomes on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, year-to-year basis, for the city, for a city of the many and not the few. And that agenda is always going to be a present agenda. So it cannot be subordinate to the past. It cannot be subordinate to the future. And that's why I said the allocation of time, energy, and resource has to be disproportionately in the present, which doesn't mean that you don't have long-term plans. Some things that require management over a period of time is also a present project. I mean, a massive regeneration, you're constantly redeveloping or developing stuff. So I think that's why I said these are concurrent things that converge at points in time. But quite simply, I would just encourage you to explore mindfulness as a territory, and I'm sure you will get the answer yourself.
Thank you for the input.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes, Anupam. If you wanted to expand on the Conscious Cities initiative,
I would love to.
I'd welcome that.
Thank you for giving me 5 minutes for that. So
Sure.
that's actually great because it leads off from the question on being present. So my current research project is something called Conscious Cities. You can actually go to inclusivecitymaking.com. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll put it in the chat group. I think I have it at the end of this deck. So if you'll just bear with me for a minute. The idea is somewhat straightforward. It's to come up with a index, a measurement framework to actually measure the well-being of communities, urban communities. And the hypothesis is that if we measure places, we measure the density of intentional places meaning places for meditation or mindfulness practice, and the frequency of use of those places, we would get one dimension of the well-being of a place, and the other dimension is obviously the well-being of individuals. I must distinguish here between mental health and mental illness, and often they get confused. Mental illness is when mental health deteriorates, but mental illness is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to management of mental health on an ongoing basis, which requires, frankly, action from the time that you are born and come to your senses. It's like brushing your teeth. So I think we haven't been necessarily taught that skill, and we've forgotten about it at a community level. So this project, it's a very straightforward project, actually. I'll just quickly run through it, some of the salient points, not everything, because it will take too much time. But we're exploring the relationship between the built environment and the citizen well-being, as I said. But it has a specific focus on inner health, on mental health, not on outward health. So just imagine you didn't have gyms for working out a few decades ago. They're recent phenomena. So I argue that we need gyms for the mind. And to the gentleman who just asked the question, a practice of being present with the mind, the body, and the spaces we inhabit, in my mind, is the most important agenda of all. And why mindfulness and meditation? Because I think science shows us now, while there has been evidence of other kinds, science shows us that there is a strong positive impact of mindfulness on mental health, including stress and anxiety. And I think we know that this is a particularly severe problem in most societies, and even managing addictive or self-destructive behaviors. So what we're proposing is that meditation is a preventive and cost-effective approach. And arguably, if you have more social spaces dedicated for community mindfulness practice, it would increase resilience in the world we live today. And I think the pandemic has shown us the need for it. So the first research objective is examine the use of public space for mindfulness and meditation and the corresponding mental health data. The second research objective, which is more about the story behind the data, is conscious cities, the index that allows us to aggregate a score that can be developed at a individual place level. You aggregate it at a city level and then potentially create some sort of a index to show the well-being of a place, a city, potentially even at a country level. So, I mean, frankly, the project is really exciting for me because I think this ought to be the main preoccupation of all societies. So these are some of the research questions. As I said, it's already available, so I'd encourage you to visit it. This is the hypothesis. I think this is quite critical that we need mental health gyms. I mean, while that sounds maybe counterintuitive, but parks can serve that purpose. But I think we need to add intentionality to it because people don't know that you can arguably meditate anywhere. But I think if you create social spaces, you also encourage entire communities starting mindfulness, which it's quite difficult to start it in the absence of support. So this idea of mindfulness being some strange activity that you do, as an abstract idea, I think it's actually quite a regular thing. So we need to normalize mindfulness. All right, I'll leave it here because I think I tend to get quite passionate about this topic, and I think Vinita may not like that. So I'll stop here, but please visit the website and write to me if you'd like to engage. I would love. I guess I can share it with this small forum. It's not public news yet, but I've been pitching to a couple of university labs, and the research project just got accepted at the Urban Analytics Lab at NUS just 2 days ago. So I'm very pleased, but we're looking for multiple host sites. There's a town in the Netherlands that signed up for the project a few days ago, 22,000 person town. So we're exploring all kinds of applications. I guess there is two sides to it, the data side of it and the storytelling side of it. So very happy to engage with, and thank you, Vinita, for giving me that opportunity. I think I'm 1 minute over, so apologies, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
No, that's fine. You can go on all afternoon as far as I'm concerned, because it's a pet theme of mine. And I definitely, I mean, Barcelona is one of those places with that kind of vibe, and I would say that it is definitely one of those conscious cities, especially around the beaches towards the east of the city. And we do have a question from Manju. What exactly does the engagement involve from the data side and the story side? So I assume, Manju, you're talking about the conscious cities, right? Yeah. If you could elaborate on that a little bit.
May I ask Manju to make herself visible and just maybe ask the question in her own words? I didn't quite understand the question. It may be helpful to expand on the question a bit.
Sure. Yeah, Manju.
So you were talking about this conscious cities, and you said you are looking for engagement with universities and other establishments.
Right. Yes, so I have actually shared in this presentation, which I don't know if I can share the presentation with you, but it's essentially looking for, at the end of the day, to prove the hypothesis, we need to run a number of experiments. And essentially we're looking for different sites because we will have to run experiments in a variety of settings. And so that's one element of the engagement. The other element, and the two are mutually non-exclusive, is to just be an advocate. I mean, my biggest motivation to do this is that mindfulness has had a tremendous impact on me, and I would encourage everyone to adopt this practice. And there are various forms, and I suspect many of you already do it, but I just feel that as a city maker and a placemaker and mindfulness practitioner, I feel that our cities are not currently designed to encourage meditation at scale, mindfulness at scale, and that could happen. I mean, there are obviously parks that you probably see in neighborhoods where you live, where there are yoga classes happening. So that is a form of meditation, or art classes happening. Those are all forms of informal meditation. But I would say that it's not enough. So we need more social spaces, not less. And these need to be universal spaces. So I think public parks and libraries and community centers are obvious places to do this, but they could be even smaller or larger places in even office settings or shopping malls or housing communities. And obviously we need presence of mindfulness teachers and meditation teachers to help lead people, to bring them into this field. And of course, eventually we need to all practice alone. So I hope that answers the question. If not, as I said, the presentation has some very specific suggestions, and I have a collaboration framework. So if you want to email me, I think I've just put my email in the chat. So I hope you've seen it. If not, I'll just put it again. And you can just write to me and we can set up a call. And I have a collaboration framework for individuals, organizations, and places that we can then have a deeper discussion on.
Yeah,
I think you put in your, sure, Manju, I think you put in your website, but not your email. So you might want
and
to,
the presentation is on the website. You can download it, and my email is also there, but I put it here as well.
That's great. I'm sure you'll find a lot of takers among our membership. So I'd like to thank you, Anupam, that you spent, I know you're a very busy person at university, and you've taken time off to inspire us. And, you know, it's the first of possibly many other like professional development series on Zoom. And I'm so happy to have you kick it off. And so I'd encourage people to stay in touch with him directly, or, you know, let me know if you want to reach out. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to make our dates in December. Or maybe
I don't
you
know.
can.
Who knows? I mean,
Yeah,
I guess we don't
knows?
know really. It's day to day. So we'll
Yes,
see.
sure. That's right. But if there's nothing else, if there's nobody else that wishes to ask a question, I think we can close the formal part and stop recording. And then some of the members or others might just want to hang around and